Well, hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Wright County Restoration Project podcast. My name is Jamin.
And I'm Sam.
And we are here to talk with you again. Sam, last week we got through the Second Amendment.
We did.
That is, we've gotten through the two that are perhaps the best well-known.
Yep.
The ones that in some ways might be the most controversial. We'll talk perhaps about the fact that maybe some of these lesser-known ones might have a greater effect in some ways on our society. And yet we made it through those, and today we might get through a couple, but we're beginning at least with the Third Amendment.
Yes.
And so why don't I go ahead and read it. These are not going to take quite as long. We're not going to perhaps be as thorough, not as much to talk about, not as much controversy in some senses surrounding them. But we'll go ahead and read the Third Amendment, and then we can kind of talk about it and see where that goes.
Sounds good.
So the Third Amendment to the United States Constitution. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. One of the things that has struck me from week to week about these amendments, and even as you go on and you get into the amendments that have been ratified significantly later in history, is how much longer they get over time. It's one of those amazing things, now bills are 5,000 pages, these omnibus bills and everything. And yet when we think about these amendments, there's a real beauty in their simplicity. They say what they need to say, they get it done, and they move on. So
Absolutely.
As we think about the Third Amendment, what are we dealing with here?
So the Third Amendment's interesting. It's one of the probably least used or quoted amendments out there. The American Bar Association called it the runt piglet of the amendments, if you want to put it that way. Kind of a funny way of putting it, but it's the least used. The Supreme Court has not used it as a primary source for any of its rulings in the whole history of the United States. Just because of the nature of the Third Amendment. It's not because it's not it's important, but it's also I think it stems from partially that have had the blessing of living in a very peaceful country.
Yep.
Yes, we've had the American Civil War on our soil, but very rarely have we had invading forces invade the United States. And that has really been a blessing, thus not really having a need for quartering soldiers in and around, in private dwellings. It's just, it's not a thing. And we're blessed to have that. It's interesting, the colonies, especially after the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War as it's called, were the British left a lot of their troops in the colonies. And this is where we see a lot of the seeds that grow into the American Revolution start. And you have, on one hand, many of the colonists who had gotten together, these were British citizens in their militias, and gone to fight the French and to be a part of this. So they saw we're capable of defending ourselves. Where on the other hand, the Crown and the King's troops kind of had a feeling like, well, we need to be over here in case something else happens, or we're still we need to make sure we keep this colony in hand because now we've paid a price to kind of hang on to it. We've used, and also Canada's in the mix now. And so it becomes an interesting thing that more and more standing armies are quartered. And it continues up until and during the Revolutionary War.
And as we look at this, there's a greater sentiment over time that with the quartering of troops, there's this divide happening between the colonists and the British from across the ocean, and there is a feeling perhaps of there being a little bit of a oppressive force, an occupying power, as it were, rather than just our troops type idea. There's a real feeling, though they are British troops and British citizens, an occupying feeling to it over time.
Yeah, and that was definitely the feeling, especially during the American Revolution, that there were constantly court-martials of these troops, and these troops were under military law. And so there are many accounts of the soldiers mistreating women, stealing property, those kind of things. And you can't go to your local magistrate and deal with that. It has to be dealt with by the British military and the British military system, court-martialed and all that. And though there may be punishments meted out, they may not be what you want them to be, or whatever, if you are a citizen that's having these soldiers quartered in your home or in your buildings. And so that is, it was very much a oppressive invading force, definitely grows in that feeling during the Revolution.
So as we look at the amendment itself, it's kind of broken into two different parts. You have the idea of no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house. And then you have, on the other hand, of course, without consent of the owner, with the consent of the owner, recognizing private property, there's the owner has every right to do so if they would desire. But then you see the second part, that nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So we don't see this as a complete nullification of any capacity for there to be the quartering of soldiers, and even the quartering of soldiers necessarily against consent. But only that it has to be prescribed by law. And one would presume that by making it to be prescribed by law, you're adding those layers of checks and balances whereby the legislature and the executive branch, and there has to be, and then of course this allows it to be checked by the judicial branch as well. And so there is within this the building in of the checks and the balances, while simultaneously not necessarily negating the possibility that there might be a time where something like this would be necessary.
Right, absolutely. And it's interesting to look at this Third Amendment, because it also brings up what we talked about last week a little bit about the founders' real fears and worries about a standing army. It was something that James Madison, in one of his debates in the Virginia Convention in 1787, said a standing army is one of the greatest mischiefs that can possibly happen. Thomas Jefferson later on wrote in a letter, "None but an armed nation can dispense with a standing army." And so these now we have definitely transitioned in our country in a way being more of the world's policeman, and for good or for worse, kind of having a bit of that empire building feel to it, that there's been a change in that definitely since the founders put this down. But there's an interesting idea, and you get this feel for sure from the Federalist Papers and others, other founding documents, that the idea of having a standing army was something that really wasn't something that they were interested in, and really would rather have a highly armed, trained populace than having a standing army, which is kind of funny to think about today.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about the history of the United States, and we talked about this, I believe, a little bit last time, that a standing army was something that even past the Civil War was not really a major thing in the country. You think about the policy, the laissez-faire policy in World War I and then going into World War II, what it took to get the United States into those wars, and the strong sentiment among particularly the politicians in the United States that this is not our battle, this is not our fight. Even I don't know if we said it just chatting last week or if it was on the podcast, but that idea where George Washington warned against getting into the entanglements of the European wars. And so we see this real hesitance and reticence among American politicians really through the mid-1900s even, about the idea of going and fighting other people's wars. And it wasn't until there's a lot of things, no doubt, that went into it. We could talk through that for a long time, but it seems as though it was really after World War II that the mindset shifted, and that's where you begin to get into the police actions of not just the Cold War, but then Korea and Vietnam and Desert Storm and all of these non-war wars that we now find ourselves in. It wasn't that way before the World Wars.
Right, and it is an interesting thing to think about, where that idea of having your soldiers are your population, are the men of a certain age, and having that ability, that was more of what the founders were planning on seeing America become, and leaving those weapons of war in the hands of the free population.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. Perhaps you all that are listening might have some thoughts into what might be the pros and the cons, and even the consequences of the United States changing this policy to a strong standing army. And I know that there's a lot of thinking about the United States as we call it, the world police, and in one sense it is an empire sort of a feel to it, though not in the way that I think history has really shown empires in the past. The United States has handled it in a very different way, and yet it might be interesting to get a little feedback from those who are listening about how it is that, or what your thoughts are about some of the policies and how things changed. Do you agree with what the founders kind of thought of as it relates to standing armies? Do you even think that standing army is something that would be, or not having a standing army, I should say, would be even possible in a world like we live in today? And I suppose that those are debates for other times and other men. But very good. So we have this Third Amendment, and we're talking about quartering of troops and whatnot. Never been really an issue in the United States. Perhaps will be one day. Maybe it's more of a prophetic amendment. But Amendment 4 is significantly more relevant, we might say, and something which comes up all the time, is constantly a part of the legal system. I'll go ahead and read it, and then we'll spend a few minutes on the Fourth Amendment. It says, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." So that is Amendment number 4. And what do we have going on here, Sam?
So when we look at the Fourth Amendment, it really stems the what would have been in the founders' minds at this time was something that is a part of that long train of abuses that we see in the Declaration of Independence. And this specific situation was the British government issuing what were called writs of assistance. A writ of assistance was kind of a broad brush thing that the British government was issuing in the colonies to basically go through a person's property and effects and all their things. And what they were really looking for were things that were contraband or from the black market. You see, the British government really propped up several large kind of privately held monopolies. We think of the East India Tea Company, other things like that. And in that, the British not only kind of picked winners and losers, but also said, you really can't go and just buy from whatever the best deal was. You're going to buy from the things that we import to you as a colony, which kind of is interesting, but that was the times they lived in. And thus, this opened up, of course, the ability to have a pretty thriving black market situation where things were smuggled in from, what we would know as, the islands in the south of Florida and Cuba and all those areas where you'd smuggle up things like sugar and those kind of things, or things down from Canada, and cloth and other things were smuggled in. And predominantly what these writs of assistance were issued for was to go through your things, but they didn't need to necessarily have any specific knowledge that you had anything wrong. They just were going to go through your things until they found something, and then once they found that, then they would prosecute you, fine you, whatever, seize the articles, and then go from there. And so this was something that was very offensive to the colonists. We have it's interesting. James Otis, who is one of the pre-founding fathers, we don't hear a lot about him because he had had kind of a issue. It was actually attacked because of some of the things he said, and really kind of lost his senses before his sharpness before the American Revolution. So we don't hear a lot about him during the Revolution, but before that he was Massachusetts probably one of their best orators. And a couple of quotes from him on this, actually in an article called "Against Writs of Assistance." This is from 1761. James Otis said, "Now, one of the most essential branches of English liberty is the freedoms of one's house. A man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle." He also wrote in that same document, in a kind of a plea to the British. "Your honors will find in the old books concerning the office of a justice of the peace precedents for general warrants to search suspected houses. But in more modern books you will find only special warrants to search such and such houses, specially named, in which the compliance as before sworn that he suspects his goods are concealed, and will find it that special warrants only are legal. In the same manner I rely on it, and the writ pray for in this petition being general, or is illegal." So it's kind of old wording, but he's putting into this, and he closes with this: It is a power that places the liberty of every man in the hands of every petty officer. So he's kind of going through it. It's a little wordy, but he's basically saying we've seen it where you have this broad brush, basically giving any law enforcement official of this time ability to go through everything instead of having a very specific, we have eyewitness that you have such and such in your property and it's, in your barn, in the back corner, whatever, that you have a very specific place you're going, not just, oh, you let us in, we're going to search everything, and oh, now we found something, now we're going to go after you because of this. And so that was something that was very, this is kind of where we get that Fourth Amendment, the foundation for it. This was why the founders were very adamant about being secure in your things.
Yeah, and with the criminal justice background I have, the Fourth Amendment was one of the ones that we studied copiously, because as one works as a police officer or judicial system or whatever it might be, you recognize that there are heavy constraints upon law enforcement. And of course, there's always ways around them. I think that in many ways the Fourth Amendment helps with corruption, and yet simultaneously there's always ways that these things can be reinterpreted and misinterpreted. And yet it really is a bulwark against corruption within the law enforcement side of things, and judicial, keeping various doors from opening all the way as it relates to stepping into someone's private property, and really even preserving this idea of innocent until proven guilty, that we're not going to come in and look for a problem, hope you have a problem or think you have a problem, look for the problem, and then when we find the problem, then attack you for the problem. And unfortunately, that's something that we see all too often today on any number of levels of government and policing and whatnot as well, within certain areas where they do that very thing, where they'll go looking for a problem, and then in finding a problem, then have the means by which to either hold that over someone's head or to prosecute them accordingly. And really, a lot of this, as we talk through it, the first bit of this is very much so recognizing, and I think it's in some ways the first true recognition in the amendments of that right to the life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness concept as it relates to property. Now, we don't see life, liberty, and property in the Declaration of Independence. We see it as a extension of what John Locke, the philosopher,
Right.
would have thought: life, liberty, and property. And we see it in the founding, the different letters of the founders and such, recognizing the particular right to having private property. Even Otis there, speaking of the castle doctrine, in one sense we might call it. Now that applies directly today oftentimes to the Second Amendment,
Right.
and the idea that you have the right to defend your home because the home is your castle. And yet here he applies it to the fact that a person can't just barge into your home and start looking for things that are wrong.
Right.
Your home is your place. This is your private property, and unless you have a reason to be in my home, unless you have a warrant, and this is still very much applicable today, police officer can knock on your door, or he can knock on the window of your car, and you can roll it down, and you can talk with them, but they are not allowed to search your car. They're not allowed to search your home unless they have a warrant, or, in this case, as we see here, specific probable cause. And that
Right.
has to be something that is obviously laid out in law, or as it would relate to the various particulars of what is being searched and what is being seized. This kind of boils down to the nature of liberty itself.
Yeah.
As I think about the Fourth Amendment, one of the things, and we'll talk about this perhaps even more next week with the Fifth Amendment, is one will say, well, yes, you have this idea where a person can't search your things, but and we see this online a lot when we have people talk about, the government spying on you online, and you say, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so what does it matter?
Right.
Well, what if they just kept combing until they found something wrong? Right? And that is the issue here, is I'm not doing anything wrong. Well, what if they started combing through your house, and wouldn't you know it, one of your electrical outlets is not up to code.
Right.
And they just keep searching and searching and searching until they find that one outlet that's not up to code, or until they find that one thing, and then through that they have an inroad to now persecute you, your family, to take away your private property and these sorts of things. And we perhaps take for granted the fact that could happen, but that's exactly what this amendment is supposed to be a bulwark against.
Right, absolutely. And that's something that I think we probably need to get back to.
Yeah.
In a way. We see through different, parts of the government now, whether it's, through the TSA,
Yep.
in the security that we've tried to gain through those type of systems. Definitely there's there can be definitely these kind of search and seizure type things that
Right.
without people's consent in that sense. Or we've seen it also with the IRS, where they'll go through someone's information and all that until they find where they didn't pay the right tax or whatever it is, and then use that against them. So it's definitely something that we should be more aware of, be able to just remember that it's there for our protection. It's holding the government accountable in how they deal with a private citizen, and that it's interesting how the American government's set up, and just how it's definitely, like you said, that innocent until proven guilty,
Right.
where the government is framed in such a way that it would rather a few guilty people get away
Yep.
than persecute an innocent person,
Right.
Which is the way the founders wanted it to be, that they were much more interested in that than broad brush trying to catch everybody
Yep.
with a huge net and then find something wrong with everyone.
Because that's the power of the monarch, right? That's the power of the tyrant. And this boils down to a fundamental element of philosophy. We took a couple of minutes in several episodes early on, and we talked about the difference between humanism and biblical Christianity, and one of the things that we understand on a philosophical level, another thing that we can understand on a philosophical level, very similar to that, is the fact that liberty, though it is a right, as the Declaration of Independence would lay it out, that is conferred to us by our Creator, not by government, liberty is something which has an inherent set of dangers. to it.
Absolutely.
Liberty is not the safest way to live. Whether that be my right to, in theory, this is not a right that we have, although one might debate about it, the right to not wear a seatbelt in my own vehicle, or the right to not wear a helmet when I'm riding a bicycle or a motorcycle. The idea that I have these opportunities to make decisions for myself that might be very bad decisions, even catastrophic or life-destroying decisions, and yet the nature of liberty and the thing which the founders so strongly defended was this idea that even at the expense of, as you said, a few guilty people, God forbid that an innocent person would spend time being bound for something which was not their fault. I'd much rather have a few guilty people let go than have innocent people bound. I'd much rather let a person make his own decisions as it relates to his life and his property than protect him through binding him. And this is what we see with the debates about, say, the TSA or the IRS. This is what we see about debates regarding the Fourth Amendment and unreasonable searches and seizures, and the good that it has done in one sense through history, that on a whim or on some random anonymous phone call, the police beat down some guy's door. And we think of this a little bit with what happened, and we're kind of putting ourselves in time here if I say this, but what happened on Christmas Day in Nashville. There was a bomb that went off, and people talk about how, well, there were warnings. There were warnings about various elements of him. Well, yes, but the police simply don't have the power to just break down a guy's door because someone calls them up and says, this is dangerous. If they have that power, then now when I get angry at my neighbor, I can just call the police and say, hey, he's making a bomb. And they'll go break down their door and shoot people and whatever else. And then I can just sit there chuckling because my enemy got what was coming to him by my hand based upon the fact that he is guilty until proven innocent. And this is that fundamental protection. And it's a protection, once again, that we often don't see in many societies, where specifically in tyrannical regimes, the possibility that someone's going to bust down your door and start searching for whatever it might be at any given time for whatever reason, whether that be a political reason, whether that be some sort of reason that is for corrupt reasons, and whether it's because you have something that somebody else wants, whatever it might be. Again, this amendment holds real sway as a means by which to check corruption. And to afford the American people liberty. And I think the question that we will continue to delve into in our society and in our culture is kind of a simple one. How much does liberty really mean to our people? Is liberty important enough? Because liberty is not the most efficient form of government. A republic is not the most efficient form of government. We could be much more efficient at dealing with crime. We could be much more efficient at dealing with dissidents. You know, people talk about the riots and whatever else, and why doesn't someone just put them down? Well, because they have rights. And riots, of course, breach those rights, but until the point where they get violent, they have the right to assemble. And while it's nasty, some of the things that are coming out of their mouths, and while it's anti-American, whatever else, that old adage, I disagree with you, but I'll fight to the death your right to say what you're saying, comes to the forefront here. Are we willing to bear the risks of liberty? And that's a tough question sometimes.
It can be. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that, you know, from looking at what the forefathers said, there's definitely, you know, in their, from what they said, they would definitely rather have all those liberties and have that dangerous liberty. But yeah, it does take personal responsibility. It and it can be quite dangerous, but it also has many freedoms. But it goes back to what we said earlier on, that it takes a self-governed moral population, people living by the precepts from the Bible and being a law unto themselves to really work within this framework of the Constitution and our founding documents to really effectively do that. And also remember what our documents say.
Right.
Like with the Fourth Amendment, a lot of people may remember that they're supposed to be secured in their things, but where does it actually say that? Well, it says it in the Fourth Amendment, and that is something that, but if we begin to lose our understanding and lose even our knowledge of those founding documents, it's much easier for so-called experts, people in the media, other people to sway our opinions or to say, well, no, that really wasn't ever in there.
Right.
It said something else. We can come in and search whatever we want. And so I think, it's being educated, but also being self-governed that allows for, that in a sense, that dangerous liberty.
Yeah, and then we also see a real balance as it relates to this within society. So one of the unfortunate things that we saw, particularly several years ago, pop up was at times where law enforcement was perhaps stepping beyond the bounds of what they could rightfully do. You saw people getting very contentious and going out of their way to be hostile to law enforcement as a
Right.
means of trying to take back a understanding of this right. And this is what we see happen in a society where institutions are starting to be eroded and trust is starting to be eroded. Is
Right.
where the police for years perhaps were pushing the bounds of what the Fourth Amendment would allow them to do, or the IRS, these various government agencies are pushing the bounds, and then when the people begin to push back, it's not a moderate push generally. Generally, the pushback is a strong push, and that pendulum keeps swinging and perhaps creating greater rises and falls with each. So it's a call as well to remember as free people and as responsible people that we exercise our liberties responsibly, and we also exercise our checks responsibly, that we do have the right to refuse the unreasonable searches and seizures, searching without a warrant. You never have to say yes to a police officer if they ask if they can search your vehicle or search your person, unless they have unless they can find probable cause, or unless they have a warrant at their disposal. And yet, a self-governed people, a reasonable people, will use these things reasonably in order to foster necessary peace and functionality within a society. Functioning within what we might call the social construct, the social contract, whereby we are working peaceably and amicably. And of course, that only comes to the extent that the people can trust their authorities, and the authorities can trust their people. And so if perhaps we can pull something from it today, that might be it. That we, along with renewing our understanding of the Third and the Fourth Amendment, and wanting to make sure that we understand, and hopefully you all, as I would desire to do, side on the side of liberty, even at the risks that it takes, also be determined that we are going to be a properly self-governed people, the thing which liberty asks of us.
Absolutely.
And only as we are that properly self-governed people can we then work within the institutions that have been erected and keep those things in balance.
Very good. Yes.
Any final thoughts on the Third and Fourth Amendment today, Sam?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of go in and start to dig into some of these amendments that aren't as well known.
Yeah.
And to really see where why were these important to the founders, especially the first 10, as we call the Bill of Rights, were really laid out, and they were something that were very important to them. Several men, because there was no Bill of Rights at the initial signing of the Constitution, withheld their signatures. They did not sign the Constitution because they felt like there was a need for these additional safeguards for the people. These are limiting the government from what the government could do to the people. And so I think it's interesting to dig into some of these, like the Third Amendment, not something that we've ever dealt with, but it's something that was very important to those those founding fathers. And then the Fourth Amendment, definitely something important and something to remember, because it's not, it may, in the past we've seen different situations where those things may have been abused, but it's the job of we the people to hold our leaders
Right.
and our law enforcement and those accountable if they do overstep those bounds, and to bring back, to curb those, oversteps.
Correct.
And to do it in a lawful and peaceful way. It's interesting, last week it was the Second Amendment, but that really, while that is the amendment to kind of protect all other amendments, it is the last amendment to use in that sense.
Right.
Where to use the speaking out, peacefully assembling, writing, electing, using all those different tools we have before it turns to something where firepower is needed. And that's definitely, even the founders were very, it was not something they wanted to jump to right away,
Right.
and was something that only with great, fear and great reluctance did they have to take up arms against their fellow countrymen, fellow British citizens. And so it's something that to look at these and to really dig in and say why are these important? Why did they put these in here? And to hold those who we've put in place to enforce the laws of the government, to hold them to these things that give us those rights.
Very well said. Well, that will wrap up our time together today with the Third and the Fourth Amendment. Mm-hmm. Next week, we'll get at least into the Fifth. Want to thank you for being a part of our time together today. We've really enjoyed this. Mm-hmm. I've enjoyed it, and you've mentioned you've enjoyed it as well. We'll continue to provide a little bit of insight and commentary. Next week, we'll get a little more into the biblical basis for some of these things. But if you enjoy what we're doing here, please please subscribe. Once again, I remind you that the email address, WCRP, Wright County Restoration Project, WCRP@legacybaptistchurch.net. Would love to hear from you, have any insights that you could add, and we'd be happy to answer questions that you might have as well. And look forward to seeing you or talking to you next time on the Wright County Restoration Project podcast.